Hi, everybody. Good evening. If you're just joining, I'm starting a little bit late today, a couple of minutes late, but we have a lot to cover today. So good evening and welcome to this week's most pertinent topics that we're going to talk about here. We will talk about the Texas heartbeat law. You saw a lot of things going on about that over the last 24 to 48 hours, and that's what we'll focus on for the first part of our stream today. And we'll also talk about voter suppression. The voter suppression bill is heading to the desk of Governor Abbott here in Texas, and so I'll definitely tell you what's going on there. And these are tied, by the way, so stay on for all of this. One of the items that has gotten completely overshadowed is the COVID-19 origins report. So if you remember, several months ago, President Biden said he wanted a full investigation into the origin of COVID-19. And that report was released late last week, but it really was glossed over by the mainstream media. And it is really important for us to know what is going on, regardless of where you are on any of what's going on out there around COVID. So we'll go into that. Of course, in a historic move, we are now out of Afghanistan, a 20-year war. And it did not end in the way we would have liked it to, because we lost 13 service members in this evacuation, and it's something definitely that we need to talk about. And last but not the least, we will talk about gerrymandering and the impact of gerrymandering and redistricting on the next decade. We have a special guest today, Walker Bragman of the Daily Poster will join us for that. So stay on for the whole show, and hopefully, you will go away with a perspective from all the way here in Austin, Texas, and what is going on in Texas. So to start off with, to break down what is happening with the Texas heartbeat law, in May, during our regular legislative session in Texas, the heartbeat law was signed into law by Governor Abbott here in Texas. And when it was signed into law, it was scheduled to go into effect on September 1st. Now, during that time, there was a lawsuit filed to put a stop on the implementation of the law in order for it to not go into effect. And so on the midnight of August 31st, people were looking for a response from the Supreme Court of the U.S. to hopefully not uphold this law, to basically put a stop on this law because it is deemed to be unconstitutional, right? So that's basically what people were waiting for. And of course, September 1st came and went, and there was no decision from the Supreme Court of the United States. In fact, the law went into effect September 1st right away. And that's what you saw yesterday happening, people commenting over it all over, social media, etc., basically banning women's healthcare in Texas. And not only banning it, but there's a lot more to it than that, what it actually does. There's several parts to it, and I'm going to go over it in a second. But on the midnight of September 1st, the Supreme Court did hand down a decision. And they handed down a decision not to block the Texas heartbeat law. Now, why is the Texas heartbeat law, such a big deal? It's a big deal because it is the most strict law when it comes to banning women's healthcare and their privacy to their healthcare that we have in our entire country. That's why it's important. It's also important that if the Supreme Court of the United States allows it to stand, even though it's deemed unconstitutional, now that means it will inspire the same law, the copycat law, across the United States in all the states where the GOP has full control of their legislator and they can implement this law. And I want to go into a little bit about this because Texas Democrats, being represented by the Texas Democrats in the legislature, had absolutely no power to stop this law from passing. And not only did they not have any power, they had no power to negotiate what's in this bill. And this is a very important point, because when Texas Democrats broke quorum after the first special session and spent 30 some days in Washington, D.C., or majority of them did anyway, what happened during that time is that the GOP Congress members continued to tell them, hey, you need to go back to Texas and work with your GOP colleagues in the legislature and negotiate. But the fact is this, they do not have any power to negotiate any bill in any committee, because the Texas GOP has a trifecta. They can literally write any bill and pass any bill. And that is a very important point to point out, that we absolutely have zero power, and this is completely tied to gerrymandering and our vote, and it's going to get even more worse, not just for Texas, but all of the United States. And that's what I would like to bring up to you towards the end of today's presentation. And I would like to spend more time on gerrymandering and what it's going to do to the next decade of not just in Texas, but across this country, and how it will take away our rights. So stay on for that. Walker Bragman is going to join us for that. And he's one of the journalists that's written about this topic, which is not being covered in a big way, even though census data just came out, because we have so many other things going on right now. So earlier today, President Biden tweeted this tweet right here. And he says, and this is, by the way, the first of a series of tweets he did, but it is really important what is in his first tweet, because the seriousness of this heartbeat law cannot be overstated and what it's doing right here. The Supreme Court's ruling overnight is an unprecedented assault. He uses the word assault because that's what it is. It's an assault on the constitutional rights of Texans under Roe v. Wade, which is the law of our land. Now, complete strangers will now be empowered to inject themselves in the most private of health decisions. So what does he mean by that? What complete strangers is he talking about? Well, here's the interesting thing. The Texas law deputizes the average person, anybody in Texas, your neighbors, anybody who's nosy enough to get in your business, to be able to sue both healthcare providers or the person seeking healthcare, reproductive healthcare. They will be able to sue you, and you can have multiple people suing you. So it can be hundreds of Texans suing one provider or one individual or one person that drove you. So the Uber that you took from your home to your provider, they can be sued, and they can be sued multiple times. That's what this has done. This has deputized average citizens and made them vigilantes, put a bounty on the heads of women, and the bounty is $10,000. So they must be paid no less than $10,000 for reporting somebody from getting health care. And if they win the lawsuit in a court of law, and by the way, they can bring this law. This is a civil lawsuit. They can bring it to any court of law in Texas. And if they win, not only does the defendant have to pay all of the bills from both sides, both legal fees, but they also have to pay the individual $10,000. That is how ridiculous and utter absurd this law is. So he talks about complete strangers will now be empowered to inject themselves in the most private of health decisions. Then he says, and this is the saddest part of this, that this law does not even allow exceptions in the case of rape or incest. The point of this law is not to just punish women in Texas. It's not to just punish Texans. And it is not just to, wage assault on the constitutional rights of Texans. The point is cruelty. There is no other point of this law. And so this is what is going on in our country, and it is so important for us to recognize what happened and how this is actually tied to voter suppression in Texas, because this did not come about in one day. It did not come about in one legislative session. In fact, it didn't even come about in the last several years. This law has been in the making for decades, because remember, the Texas GOP would not have been able to actually pass this law if they didn't have the trifecta control that they have, if they had to negotiate with their Democratic counterparts in the Texas legislature, but they don't have to. And that's where I want to get to next. The next part, we go into the Texas's voter suppression bill, which you've heard about. Now, this bill has been introduced 3 times in the Texas legislature. First, it was introduced into the regular session. On the last day of the regular session, when the vote was about to be taken on the Texas voter suppression bill, Democrats walked out, they broke quorum, and they bought time. They put a hold on passing this law. Governor Abbott turned around and within days called a special session here in Texas. During that special session, Texas House Democrats broke quorum. They went to Washington, D.C. to avoid being arrested in Texas, because the law does say that they can be, prosecuted, or rather brought in against their will. They can be arrested, rather. And so they went to Washington, D.C., and they brought up the challenges in this voter suppression bill. And I'll go over some of them, right? We're not talking just about, 24-hour voting being banned, which it is. We're not just talking about curbside voting being banned, which it is. But we're talking about ridiculous things like making sure that your social security number on your mail-in voting application, which you might have done several months before, exactly matches the ID number that you use when you actually go vote. So when you fill out your mail-in ballot, you have to use the same number, the same ID. Now, that might sound simple, but you can use both your driver's license, or you can use your state ID, or you can use your your driver's license, state ID, or your social security number, the last 4 digits of your social security number. So you can use either of them, and they must match. They must match from when you register to vote to when you apply to vote by mail to when you vote by mail. So it's something that you can imagine is a very simple, honest mistake that anyone can make, right? When you register to vote, you might have used your last 4 digits of your social. But when you actually go to vote, you may use your driver's license because you don't remember what you used, especially if you registered to vote 10 years ago or 20 years ago, right? So these are the crazy things that are in this voter suppression bill. Oh, I want to go over each one of them with you. So after the Democrats broke quorum, they were there, and eventually after that first special session expired, there was a second special session that was called right away by Governor Abbott here in Texas. And during that time, the Democrats rejoined the Texas legislature, and approximately a week and a half into that legislative session, they did have quorum. And during that time, Senate Bill 1, which had already passed in the first special session, was reconciled in the House, and Senate Bill 1 was eventually passed. It went back and forth and eventually passed, and it ended up exactly where it started, which is not only these bans on drive-through voting and 24-hour voting. And I know a lot of you may be like, okay, well, what's the big deal on drive-through voting? The big deal is very simple. Texas allows curbside voting for people who are unable to get out of their car and make it to a polling location. So for example, maybe you have a disability or you have a challenge being able to go in, it's already allowed. And the argument for not allowing drive-through voting is that you would not have privacy in your car. But here's how ridiculous the argument is. Anybody who is 65 and older in Texas can vote by mail. So can some other people that qualify. For example, if you are going to be out of state on the day of voting, you can request a absentee mail-in ballot and you can fill that out. Or if you have some disability, you can also request a mail-in ballot. Now, when you are filling out your mail-in ballot, you may be doing it in the privacy of your own home, and you may be doing it on your kitchen table. Anybody in your home can look over your shoulder and see what you are, filling in for your vote. So to assume that you would have privacy no matter what, first of all, doesn't make sense. But let's just assume you don't allow anybody to go look at what you're voting, right? You can also ask the person in the car with you to step outside so you can finish voting, and then they can step back in if there is someone in the car with you. So you can see that there's absolutely zero logic. There's absolutely zero logic behind wanting to ban drive-through voting. The fact that they ban drive-through voting is not the point. The reason that they ban drive-through voting is what is really out there and ridiculous. So those are banned. Then you have the ban on the distribution of mail-in ballot applications. So no state official can do that, even if the person 100% qualifies for a mail-in ballot. You can't even send them the application. So remember, we're not talking about distribution of the mail-in ballot itself. We're talking about an application for a mail-in ballot. So for example, everybody 65 and over in the state of Texas can vote by mail. So technically, if you send everybody an application, the chances of getting higher voter turnout, right, is much higher because they have the application in front of them. It's been mailed to you. Now you can fill it out. And all of a sudden you have your mail-in ballot in your home. That is no longer allowed. Making voting by mail mistakes is what I talked about earlier, which is, voter ID is already required in the state of Texas. You cannot vote here without a voter ID, with a government issued. If you don't have a government issued ID, you cannot vote in Texas. Now, this just makes it more difficult. It gives you lots of ample opportunity to make ridiculous mistakes so that, for some reason your ballot can basically be invalidated because, the two numbers that you had don't match, for example, the two ID numbers that you used. And then it goes on and on. It enhances poll watcher protection. So now it allows poll watchers to roam around freely while you're trying to vote. They can go as closely enough to you to be able to hear conversations you're having. Let's say, for example, you're asking for some directions, etc., or you're assisting someone to vote. They can basically cut in and have that, listen to that conversation with you, and on and on and on. So it really, really creates another sort of vigilante system for poll watchers, giving them all of this ability to kind of interfere, and in as a consequence, possibly not just interfere but intimidate voters. And there are a lot of people that are not going to stand up to them just because they don't want any trouble in Texas. Remember, right now, they also passed the law that you can carry around a gun with any kind of permit too. So things are pretty, all over the place in Texas. So a lot of people are already intimidated by just what is going on in Texas. On top of that, now you're putting enhancing these poll watcher protections. Very difficult to remove a poll watcher, by the way. You have to go through this entire process to be able to remove a rowdy person, or if someone is violating your rights in some way, it will be more difficult to remove them. But that's not the crazy part. I left the two crazy parts for the very end. So crazy number one is now they're going to establish monthly citizenship checks. And you're like, well, what is that? How can you register to vote if you're not a citizen? Well, the answer is you can't. You can't register to vote. It's illegal to register to vote if you're not a U.S. citizen. But what happens is there are many people in Texas who are permanent residents, so they're green card holders. And when they go in to renew their driver's license, they are able to also register to vote. So if you go in and you're not a U.S. citizen, they would say, hey, would you like to register to vote? And you'd be like, no. I can't register to vote. So you've now said you're not eligible to register to vote. So the Department of Motor Vehicles has now registered that. They've taken that input into their system. Now all of a sudden you get your U.S. citizenship. So you go in to renew your driver's license, and then they ask you, would you like to register to vote? And you say yes. So now what the state of Texas wants to do is every single month check who had said before they weren't eligible, but they are eligible now, and should they be eligible? And they want to do this every single month. Think about it. There is no case in Texas that has been prosecuted where someone has not been eligible to vote and has registered to vote even though they're not a U.S. citizen. There's no case like this. So there's no reason to pass this law. But in 2019, Texas did this, and they inadvertently, they say, took off hundreds, I believe more than thousands of people off the voter rolls by saying that you're really not eligible, even though these people had become US citizens and were eligible and did register to vote. So this is what happened in 2019. They didn't issue any apology to anybody. And in fact, they just got away scot-free by abusing the rights of Texans in our state. Now, they're going to do this every single month. So you can imagine what's going to happen. This is not just a law that they're passing. This is an intentful law to disenfranchise voters. And guess what? In the last census, 95% of the growth in Texas population was Latino voters, it was Asian voters, it was Black voters. 95% of the growth of the population. So they have an incentive, and this is intentional. But last but not the least for sure, is they have now criminalized certain types of voter assistance. Not only have they made it more difficult to provide voter assistance, they have now made it so if you assist a voter, you now have to sign under the penalty of perjury multiple things that you haven't, made it, you didn't force them to accept you as someone to support, and so on and so forth. So it just goes on and on and on. And the important thing about this, and I'll get to it when we talk about gerrymandering with Walker Bragman, who's going to join us, is that there are lots of things that are going on in Texas, and it's all about stranglehold by the GOP on Texas, and it's about keeping that stranglehold and utilizing ultimate power, and that's where we are in Texas. When I started, I said that, we wanted to talk about the origins of COVID. As you know, across this country, specifically in Texas, we have the Delta variant causing havoc across, our state. And schools just opened this week for many, many counties across the state, so we'll see how that goes. But obviously there are too many people in hospitals, in ICUs right now, struggling with COVID-19. This week, end of last week, the Office of the Director of the National Intelligence actually released a report. In fact, they released a one-page, one-paragraph, unclassified findings of the origin of COVID. And before I get to that, I do want to come over and show you what the statement from President Biden was on that before I go into the rest of it. So here it is. This is the statement by President Biden, as you can see. And he does say, and this was published on August 27th, he says that this week, I received a report on the 90-day sprint that I asked our intelligence community to conduct into the origins of COVID-19 pandemic. And then he goes on and on about that he's grateful for the thorough, careful, objective work of our intelligence professionals. And while this review has concluded, our efforts to understand the origins of this pandemic will not rest. And that is because the report did not come to a specific conclusion. So that's what he's talking about there. Now, I do want to show you what actually happened in the unclassified document. So this unclassified document is available on dni.gov. It's right on the front page, so you can go read it for yourself. But it is really interesting to see that there was not a lot of talk about this in the mainstream media. In fact, last Sunday on all the political shows, there was hardly any mention of this. There was maybe a 15-second mention of this report. And as you can see, this is the unclassified version, and it's one page and sort of like two little paragraphs here. But I want to read to you, what the key takeaways here are. So the IC is the intelligence community. They are saying that the intelligence community is assessing that this virus that causes COVID-19 probably emerged and infected humans through an initial small-scale exposure that occurred no later than November 29th. So there's some sort of exposure. They confirmed that the first known cluster of COVID-19 did arise in Wuhan, China in December 2019. So that was, concluded. Now, the intelligence community was also able to reach broad agreement on several other key issues. Okay, what are those issues? We judged that the virus was not developed as a biological weapon. So this is a very important part. They do not believe that this virus was developed as a weapon specifically. And most agencies also assess with low confidence that this virus was probably not genetically engineered. However, so he says most agencies, not all. So several agencies participated in this investigation. Most of them concluded that it probably was not genetically engineered. However, 2 agencies believe there was not sufficient evidence to make any assessment either way. Finally, the IC assesses China's officials did not have foreknowledge of the virus before the initial outbreak of COVID-19. So they don't believe that there was foul play here from China. So that was that. But here are some of the most interesting things. 4 of these IC elements, that means 4 of these agencies, I believe, and the National Intelligence Council assess with low confidence, and this is a very important word, with low confidence, that this initial infection was most likely caused by a natural exposure to an animal infected with or a close progenitor virus. So they're saying with low confidence that it came from an infected animal. That's what they're saying. That's 4 of them. Now, one of those intelligence community assessed with moderate confidence. So notice this says low confidence and this says moderate confidence. So moderate confidence, I assume, is with more confidence than low confidence, but obviously not high confidence, right? That the first human infection with the SARS virus was SARS-CoV-2 virus was most likely the result of a lab-associated incident involving experimentation, animal handling, or sampling by the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Analysts says 3 of these elements remain unable to coalesce around either explanation without additional information, with some analysts favoring natural origin, others lab origin, and some seeing the hypothesis as equally likely. So there you have it. There we go. So there you have it. So I just read to you the actual unclassified document. So two questions. One is, why is this document, why is the investigation classified? This virus has upended the lives of every single person in the United States and pretty much across the world. More than 600,000 Americans have lost a loved one to this virus. High school kids haven't been able to go to prom. Graduation parties have been lost. Kids haven't really had a proper schooling in an entire year. They've been doing this homeschooling and in-person schooling and back and forth. It is so important for us as Americans to have full access to what the investigation found without any kind of unclassified or classified portions to it. We need to be able to see where the source of this virus was and how we can prevent it in the next generation. And I want to leave you with that thought, because I can't for any reason figure out why this would be classified in any way, shape, or form. And that is the most, I think, challenging thing for me. And I want to end with, again, what the White House said on their page, what President Biden said, because I agree with this 100%. We must have full and transparent accounting of this global tragedy, and nothing less is acceptable. So, nothing less is acceptable. I leave you with that. And let's talk about Afghanistan before we end. So before we end today, I want to first play something about Afghanistan that was played on the Sunday news.
This isn't about reliance. This is about ensuring that we use the leverage.
Oh, whoops.
This isn't about reliance. This is about ensuring that we use the leverage we have available to us, and it is considerable, to hold the Taliban to its commitments. The Taliban have both communicated to us privately and publicly that they will allow for safe passage. We're not just going to take their word for it. We've rallied dozens of countries from around the world to stand with us in saying to the Taliban that if they do not follow through on those commitments, there will be significant consequences. And the leverage we have, the economic leverage and the other forms of leverage we continue to possess, we believe will be effective in ensuring that we can get out other people who want to come out after the 31st of August.
So what I want to talk about this. Here, he is talking about this considerable leverage that we had. And the question that Americans should be asking is that if we have considerable economic leverage, which is something that I talked about all of last cycle, 2020, when I was running for office, and people asked me how I felt about the United States, invading other countries, and what I felt about our foreign policy. If we have considerable economic leverage, we must ask why this considerable economic leverage was not an option 20 years ago, before we spent $2.3 trillion and are about to still spend billions of dollars more for healthcare and taking care of PTSD, of Veterans Affairs and Veterans benefits for years to come. Not to mention the fallout for the American people, the thousands of veterans' families that have to deal with loved ones and their family members suffering from PTSD and other physical and mental health challenges. Why wasn't that taken into consideration before we lost thousands of American soldiers to death? We have thousands of dead Americans beyond soldiers, by the way. There are also journalists that died, and not to mention 200,000 or more Afghans that died in this 20-year period. And when we exited on August 30th, one day before we were supposed to, the news was somber in the United States. We talked about, the 13 soldiers that passed away during this evacuation when there was an incident at the airport. There were also 200 Afghans that died. Not to mention hundreds more that are injured from that bomb blast during this evacuation. So if we have considerable economic advantage and we have this leverage that we can use, shouldn't we be using this leverage before we consider going to war ever again? And that is the real test, not what the mainstream media is saying or whether we're appreciating the fact that we're out of this war. The question is, will this happen again? And with that, let's go to what's happening on the reconciliation bill. So today, there was yet another curveball thrown into the passage of the $3.5 trillion reconciliation bill. And no surprise, it came in a form of an op-ed from Senator Joe Manchin saying why he won't support spending another $3.5 trillion. And he talks about his main point here is inflation and debt. I want to say two things here. One, the price challenges that we see in the market right now are because of supply chain challenges. If you really go read the literature and understand what's going on, there is no inflation going on here that's really of significance. We have supply chain issues, and because of this pandemic throwing our entire supply chain, our industries into chaos, it is causing a lot of variation in prices that you see even at a consumer level. That's number one. Number two, when we talk about debt, remember the debt that the United States carries, the debt and the debt ceiling that we talk about, that debt is an investment into the American people and into our country. The United States government does not balance budgets. They print money. So everything is paid for by the Treasury printing money. When they take your taxes at the end of the year, they're removing money from the economy to handle inflation. That's what they're doing. They're not using your taxpayer dollars specifically to pay for their expenditures. So when we talk about debt and we talk about the debt ceiling, you want to keep in mind that when we don't do these things, we don't get free 2-year college. We don't get, paid leave and medical leave. We don't make the child tax credits permanent, and many of you are benefiting from those child tax credits. And the list goes on and on and on. So that's what this $3.5 trillion is. It's an investment into the American people that create every single bit of value in our country by the virtue of getting up in the morning and going to work every single day. So with that, I want to move over to our next topic, which is we're going to talk about gerrymandering, and we're going to bring in Walker Bragman to this show. So let me see if I can get him on here. Hey, Walker, can you hear me?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Okay, great. Thank you so much for joining, and thanks for went over just a little bit, but you are on, and we are here live. So first of all, thanks for joining. I really, really appreciate it. And we're going to talk about gerrymandering and the next decade. And you are one of the very few people that is actually writing on this topic. So thank you for joining. I really, really appreciate it. I want to allow you to join, introduce yourself. I know that you're with the Daily Poster, but tell the audience a little bit about who you are and why this topic is important.
So thanks for having me. I am a journalist. I write for the Daily Poster, which is a small independent outlet. We cross-publish with Jacobin and a number of other places. Before that, I was an independent journalist. I wrote for Paste Magazine, Salon, and way back in the day, and then a few other places. So, yeah.
All right.
I've been talking about the 2020 election and the upcoming census since 2015, warning about it, and that Democrats should prioritize, winning in a census year, try to prioritize those down ballot races, and it's frustrating seeing what's actually happening. You just cut out. Your volume just cut out.
Oh, yeah. So can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah. So I want to bring up your article here on the screen so people can kind of see it. So why don't you talk us through what you are talking about in this article?
So, if you read the article, for people who have not read it, every 10 years there is a census, and then after that census, there is a redrawing at the state level of congressional and state legislative districts. Now, in a number of states, most states, 37 states, that process is done by elected officials, which leaves open the possibility or reality of political influence. So 20 of those 37 states right now are controlled by Republicans, and only 8 are controlled by Democrats. So what we're looking at is a Republican, dominated process where they will redraw the districts as they see fit. Now, this is dangerous for Democrats because after the 2010 census, Republicans had a plan to weaponize gerrymandering, partisan gerrymandering, where they would draw the districts to favor their majorities heavily, so heavily, in fact, that in Pennsylvania in 2012, after the redistricting had happened, Democrats won 51% of the vote statewide in the congressional races. And despite that, they only came away with 5 of the 18 congressional seats in the state. And in order to win that extra, an extra seat, they would have needed 56% of the vote, which would have been a historic high. So that map was eventually struck down by a court, but it stayed in place for years. In fact, the striking down of that map helped give the Democrats the House back in 2018. So we are looking at gerrymanders that you cannot out-organize, you cannot beat them, and it seemed for a while that Democrats were going to do something about it. I mean, H.R. 1, or the For the People Act, would ban gerrymandering. It had a number of provisions related to gerrymandering, including transparency requirements and independent commissions to redraw the districts in each state, along with that straight-up ban. Now, that law needed to be passed months ago, really, in order for the totality of those provisions to take effect. It needed to be passed months ago. Unfortunately, it was not. And it's September now, so last month, on August 12th, the U.S. Census Bureau released the census data to the states, which will allow them to begin the process of redrawing districts. And unfortunately, that happened before any reform was passed. So now gerrymandering is going to happen, and it looks as though Democrats have blown their chance. They had 8 months to do it. It looks like they've completely, blown the chance to do anything about it. The maps that get redrawn and put in place will likely last a decade unless they get struck down by courts. Unfortunately, the states where the gerrymandering is going to happen, like Texas, the courts are pretty heavily conservative. So it doesn't really bode well for any policies that people, progressives like me, would like to see, like Medicare for all or any of these or climate change legislation. I mean, hell, that's a really big one. But yeah, and also just to add to this, the gerrymandering that we're going to see is going to be even more intense than the gerrymandering after 2010, because in the interim, between then and now, there were 2 Supreme Court decisions. One struck down Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act, which was the formula for federal pre-clearance. So in order to make changes to your election laws, if you were a jurisdiction that had a history of racial segregation, you had to pre-clear that with the Justice Department, and that provision is now effectively gone because that old formula, the court said it's not needed anymore, it's not necessary, it doesn't work anymore. And then the second decision that happened was in 2019. The court said that partisan gerrymandering is a political question, and therefore we can't do anything about it. So it's going to be gerrymandering off the chain.
So just to sort of clarify for our viewers, if you're watching this, what SCOTUS basically said in 2019, which Walker just said, is that partisan gerrymandering is something that they don't have any say over, right? That's what they said, which basically means partisan gerrymandering is okay, because that's exactly, by the way, what Texas is a victim of. That's exactly what was planned, and Tom DeLay is the architect of partisan gerrymandering in Texas. He did this in early 2000. And while you were talking, I was showing one of the websites here, which is this is a really great analysis that's done by this university here, the Loyola Marymount University, I believe they are. Loyola Marymount University. They have done a really nice analysis on what happened, and what they have here is an interactive map where it shows in the 2020 cycle how many states had complete GOP control in terms of the partisan alignment of the institution that was responsible for drawing district lines. And here you see a splattering of red states, including Texas, Kansas, Utah, Florida, Virginia, Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Michigan. And you go to 2010, and all of a sudden this map becomes very red. Now you've added all these southern states, North Carolina, South Carolina, Alabama, and you've added Indiana, and so on and so forth. And then when you go to 2020, it becomes even more red. So this is the partisan alignment of the institution with responsibility for drawing district lines. So if you have this many states that are completely GOP controlled, and they are drawing the district lines, guess how they're going to draw the district lines. It's pretty obvious, right? So I was showing this interactive map to make the points that you were talking about of what happened between 2000 and then the 2013, Shelby. I think that's Shelby versus
Shelby County versus Holder. Yeah.
Shelby County versus Holder. And then in 2019, what happened, I think that was a case out of San Antonio, and it went to SCOTUS, and then it was basically like, yeah, partisan gerrymandering is okay. And it seems like nobody's paying attention to what partisan gerrymandering can do for our representation, because you can't, like you said, out-organize in partisan gerrymandering, right? So why do you think the Democrats have kind of, lost their way when it comes to this? Like, it seems like, places like California, Pennsylvania, Arizona, Colorado, some areas where they might have an advantage, they've given up, their ability to have any say. Well, I wouldn't say any say, but to have all say in redistricting.
So that is a good point, and I'm glad you brought it up. That in blue states like New York and California, they've gone to this independent commission model, which is great. It's great. You want to see that nationally. The problem is, when the other side doesn't do that, it amounts to disarming. And look, I think the biggest problem here isn't necessarily blue states, going and having independent commissions redraw their maps. Look, in New York, the legislature could overrule the independent commission and draw its own maps, and that is a Democratic legislature. The real problem is that Joe Biden promised that he would overhaul voting rights on the campaign trail. He promised that he was the guy who was going to get the Democratic Party back on track after Trump, and he had 8 months and he didn't do it, and he let it sit, and they didn't talk about it, and he didn't prioritize it. Nobody talked about redistricting. It's inexcusable. He was the vice president the last time the Republicans redrew the districts and killed the Obama administration's momentum and any hope it had of passing its agenda after 2010.
But you're talking about right now in 2020, but like you saw those maps that they have, right? Like what happened in 2000 when census data came out? What happened in 2010? What do you think happened over the last 3 decades? Where were the Democrats when Republicans were using this strategy as a way
getting
to
outfoxed at every step? And honestly, I mean, look, Democrats. I don't want to speculate too much about what was going on with the party within the party leadership back in 2000. I was still in middle school at the time. I have no, but
But what about state legislators?
There's no excuse at this point, with this history, having seen this now play out, having lived through it. Pelosi, Schumer, Biden, they've been in office for years. They know how this goes. They had 8 months to do something. They've had a trifecta for 8 months. They have no plan to pass it. They have no plan to pass it, redistricting reform now. And I'm hearing from my sources in the House that it's not happening. So,
and the Texas
scenario,
Democrats were in Washington D.C. for a whole month, begging our Democratic legislators to do something, because we're in a fix here in Texas too.
Yeah, look, it's very bad. It speaks to, I think, to a certain extent, it is incompetence. You can't get it. You have to use that word. You can't get around it. And I think people also attribute it to malice. Say it's easier to sort of fundraise when you're not in power. But I don't attribute to malice what incompetence could easily explain. And I think that I don't think that there's sort of a big picture vision in the Democratic Party leadership. It seems sort of hapless watching this administration struggle through, any issues really. What have they've passed one major bill in 8 months? They've done a COVID relief bill. They're not any closer to passing this infrastructure bill that they've been talking about after they failed to pass voting rights. Like, it's bad. It's very bleak. And I hope that people learn this lesson, because, we had a moderate candidate who said, I know how to get things done. Being a moderate is the way to go. And that's, Republicans will work with me. Democrats will work with me. Well, he can't even keep his own caucus together. He can't even get Manchin and Sinema. Like, you're talking about 2 votes
Yeah.
You need 2 votes to save your party for a decade. To do anything, to even save the planet. I mean, the new the International Panel on Climate Change, just came out with that report warning of dire consequences if we don't radically decarbonize our energy economy, and yet nothing. If we don't reform redistricting, there will be 10 more years of inaction on climate change, and we just can't afford that. Our democracy can't afford 10 years of inaction on other issues as well. Like, it's bad. It's really, really bad. I don't know. There's no other way to say it. It's very bleak, and people should be mad, and they should remember it the next time they go to the polls to vote in a primary election. You know, it's just, I don't know if they're going to have a chance to do that for another 10 years.
Yeah, so there you have it, Walker Bragman on his views on what is going on in gerrymandering. I really, really appreciate you coming on and talking to us about this and, filling us in and all the details and what's going on. The one thing that I want to leave our viewers with, that no matter whether, states are gerrymandered or not, and even if our representation in Congress and U.S. Congress is limited by this gerrymandering for this entire decade, statewide races are still up for grabs. So we can still win the Senate. If every single Democrat registers to vote, gets out to vote, we can flip these seats statewide. There's no gerrymandering statewide. So I say this over and over again because in Texas, the only option that we do have is to win statewide races. We are gerrymandered to the fullest, to the max, and we have very few, if any, legal, pathways to changing that until we flip the state and take back Texas. So with that, I want to thank you for coming on. I really, really appreciate it. And hopefully we'll see you again, bring you back to talk about, other items and so forth.
Yeah, I hope next time I won't be so bleak and whatnot. I swear.
I hope you'll have more good news. Yes.
I'm a blast at parties. Anyway, have a wonderful night.
Okay, already. So we'll end that right here. And to finish off our conversation to today, to end our stream here today, I want to thank you for joining. If you've been watching, we've covered a bunch of topics. Obviously, the big one is the Texas heartbeat law. We talked about the voter suppression bill, which is tied to what's happening in Texas. We have these horrible, cruel bills because of what's happened in Texas in terms of gerrymandering and our representation being, suppressed in a big way. But we can change that at the state level. There is a light at the end of the tunnel. In 2018, we came very close to winning a Senate seat with former Representative Beto O'Rourke. And we can do that again if we get every single vote out from every single Democrat in the bluest cities, San Antonio, Austin, the Dallas-Fort Worth area, and Houston. We can flip statewide seats, and we have to vote Governor Abbott out. If we can take back our control at the state level, we can slowly start to have impact at the U.S. congressional level and at the state legislative level, and slowly bring moderation and common sense rules to our state. So with that, I want to thank you for joining. I hope you enjoyed today's stream. Thank you to our guest, Walker Bragman. And next week, of course, we'll not only talk about the topics that are in the news all week, but we will talk a little bit more about gerrymandering and redistricting in detail about what is going on in Texas, because Texas is getting 2 new congressional seats. And that is going to change up the makeup and redistricting of Texas, not just at the state legislator level, but definitely at the U.S. congressional level. And as you all know, I am running for U.S. Congress in what we believe will be a Democratic-leaning seat in Austin, Texas. If we can have the turnout that we did in 2020 in Northwest Austin and in this area, and we can duplicate that for Travis County and all across this great state of Texas, we can have impact at statewide level races. You know, the governor's up for re-election, the lieutenant governor is up for re-election, and our indicted AG is up for re-election. So there's a lot at stake, a lot of things on the ballot in 2022. And with that, I want to thank you for joining and have a good night.